The waves that day were not cruel, but indifferent, low and glassy, reflecting the pale sky like a mirror of forgetting. It was the 17th of November, 1961, and the warm breath of the Arafura Sea swept quietly across a carved wooden canoe drifting between two worlds. Michael Rockefeller, the 3-year-old son of New York Governor and future U.S. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, sat perched on the outrigger edge, his eyes fixed on the wavering horizon. He was calm, focused, and perhaps already vanishing. Hours earlier, the catamaran had capsized offshore. He and his Dutch companion had clung to the wreck for nearly a day, waiting for rescue that never came. As the sun beat down and the current dragged them farther from land, Michael spoke with a strange conviction. "I think I can make it," he said, tying empty gasoline cans to his waist as flotation. Then he let go, slipped into the water, and began paddling toward the dense, far-off jungles of southwestern New Guinea. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw him alive. No storm, no shark attack, no desperate cry, just the rhythm of his strokes, then the ocean swallowing his shape, slowly, until even that was gone. His disappearance was immediate and unreal, as if he had stepped behind a curtain that no one else could see. The surface of the sea closed like a polished lid, and yet, the story didn't end there. It clung to the edges of his name like wet sand that won't brush off. A Rockefeller didn't just disappear. He was heir to one of the most powerful families in American history. Wealth, politics, art, and ambition woven into his DNA. His father launched a massive search within hours. Helicopters, planes, boats, even missionaries and colonial officials. They combed the mangrove-fringed rivers and jungle-choked islands of what was then known as Dutch New Guinea. But not a trace. No footprints in the silt, no torn clothing, no body bloated to the surface. Michael had vanished, not just into geography, but into myth. And what made it worse, what made it linger for decades, was that he had walked willingly toward it. He had been in love with the edge, obsessed with the Asmat people, a Papuan tribe known for their intricate wood carvings, their fierce warrior traditions, and, until recently, their history of headhunting and ritual cannibalism. While others saw savagery, Michael saw art, culture, and a mirror to something America had forgotten. He believed in proximity, getting close enough to touch the truth, and sometimes, truth touches back. In the weeks before his disappearance, he had been traveling along the coast, collecting artifacts for New York's Museum of Primitive Art. He was fluent in anthropology, a Yale graduate with a camera slung over his shoulder, and barefoot sincerity in his voice. Locals described him as kind but insistent, brave, perhaps too much. The Asmat land was changing violently under Dutch rule, and Michael arrived like a specter from another world, asking questions no one wanted to answer. The night before he vanished, the ocean had already begun its soft warning. An engine failed. A storm brewed far away. The tide pulled slightly harder than usual. It's always small things in the beginning. There's an eerie symbolism in the last items he left behind. A half-drowned companion, a toppled boat, a logbook now dry in a museum case. But no clock was found, no shoes washed ashore, just the quiet certainty of the sea, the cruel poetry of distance. The world waited for days, then weeks, then decades, and still, something in the air over those waters feels wrong. The way it shifts, like memory stirred by wind. Some swear they saw a white man living among the tribes long after 1961. Others insist he was taken, killed, eaten. There are bones in those forests. Some say just not his. But the water won't speak. It never does. The telegram reached New York like a shiver down a nation's spine. Michael Rockefeller is missing. No elaboration, no comfort. just the awful, echoing absence wrapped in official phrasing. At first, there was disbelief, then a quick, surgical kind of panic. Because the Rockefellers didn't vanish. They were not born to be forgotten. Nelson Rockefeller reacted with a sharp, sleepless urgency. Within hours, he chartered aircraft, summoned diplomats, and deployed the full weight of American influence across an obscure corner of the world most Americans couldn't find on a map. A private jet carried him to the Dutch East Indies. The media followed. Newspapers bled headlines. Rockefeller heir feared dead in cannibal land. Behind the bold fonts, beneath the photo spreads of Michael's bespectacled, earnest face, a quiet war of narratives began. The official version, the one the Dutch colonial authorities offered, was almost too tidy. Michael, they said, had likely drowned. The current was strong. The distance was far. Accidents happened in remote places. But the statement landed with a thud. Drowned, without a body, without clothing, bone, blood, or sign? Nelson didn't believe it. Not entirely. The Rockefeller name carried immense cultural weight. Political dynasties, philanthropic empires, entire galleries of art and architecture. But what haunted Nelson now was the unbearable intimacy of powerlessness. All his money, all his reach, and his son was gone, possibly devoured by a world so far from Fifth Avenue it may as well have been another planet. The search expanded rapidly. Helicopters buzzed over tangled mangroves. Boats skated across tea-colored waters. Military units sliced through thickets of mosquito-heavy jungle. Loudspeakers in Dutch, English, and Talkpaisan blasted messages through the trees. Michael Rockefeller is missing. He is our friend. Please help us find him. But there was another sound beneath that. A hush. The hush of the Asmat people. In the villages of Otsjanep and Piramapan tribes, once decimated by Dutch raids, faces turned impassive when asked about the white man. Hands that once carved ancestral spirits into driftwood refused to gesture. The silence wasn't ignorance. It was protection. Perhaps guilt. Or perhaps something sacred. By the third day, the Dutch announced a shift. The mission was now recovery, not rescue. The tide had turned from hope to paperwork, a quiet funeral of assumptions. And yet, rumors leaked like river water through a palm leaf roof. Missionaries stationed nearby told of Asmat warriors whispering about a lone outsider walking through the sago forests, white-skinned, barefoot, dazed. A French priest insisted he had seen Michael alive after the official disappearance. One villager even claimed to have spoken with him. Still, nothing definitive emerged, only a strange pattern of half-truths and trailing ends. Witnesses were mistaken. Reports were inconclusive. And then quietly, the Dutch declared the case closed. It was more than convenient. It was strategic. Because at the heart of this story lay a dangerous contradiction. If Michael had drowned, it was a tragedy. If he had been killed or worse, cannibalized, it was an international crisis. The Netherlands was trying to retain control over the colony. The Rockefeller name drew global attention. An incident of murder by indigenous people could destabilize everything. And so, the most useful answer was none. The Rockefeller family returned home without their son. Nelson gave no public cry of anger, only a press statement laced with stoicism. We have reason to believe he is no longer alive. But in private, letters would later reveal he clung to doubt. Until his death, Nelson kept a carved Asmat figurine, Michael's last gift to him, on a shelf above his desk. A reminder, perhaps, of how even giants are helpless before the tide. There's a strange gravity to names like Rockefeller. They weigh down whatever story they enter. But in this case, the name only deepened the mystery. It attracted power, yes, but also concealment, as if the world, faced with the enormity of that loss, couldn't bear to tell the full truth. Or worse, couldn't afford to. In time, the search stopped. The headlines faded. The world turned its gaze elsewhere, but the swamps of New Guinea kept breathing, and among the reeds, the suspicion remained that Michael Rockefeller did not vanish because the jungle took him. He vanished because someone made him vanish. The Asmat region of southwestern New Guinea is not a place that forgets. Its memory clings to wood and river, to blood and ceremony, passed mouth to mouth in a language older than conquest. It is not bound by Western chronology. Time is circular here. Deaths echo until they are answered. And in 1961, something had shifted in that sacred balance. When the search teams left, when the last helicopter flapped its indelicate wings over the village rooftops and vanished into the blue, the jungle exhaled. Quiet returned. But it wasn't peace, it was weight. And in certain longhouses, stories began to reawaken. American anthropologist Tobias Schneebaum, who had lived among the Asmat, once described their code of vengeance. No death is without reason, no murder without reply. When Dutch forces had launched retaliatory raids against headhunting parties years earlier, the Asmat had counted their dead. Ritual demanded a return, not in cruelty, but in balance. And now, a solitary white man had washed ashore. Witness accounts, preserved in notebooks, and off-the-record interviews, describe a figure exhausted, shivering, with skin blistered and pale, emerging near the village of Otsianep. Some say he was captured while trying to speak. Others claim he was welcomed, offered food, and allowed to sleep. But something changed. A detail lost. A taboo crossed. One tale, repeated with uncanny consistency among rival clans, speaks of a night ritual, a bis ceremony, when ancestor poles are raised and vengeance is invoked through sacred chants. That night, the villagers said, a decision was made, not out of hatred, but necessity, to settle a blood debt with Dutch ghosts. And the outsider became a symbol, not Michael Rockefeller, the man but the echo of colonial violence, dressed in soft skin and foreign eyes. They say his name was never spoken aloud again. Years later, in whispered conversations behind market stalls and thatched walls, Dutch missionaries heard strange admissions. A hunter in Piramapan admitted to being one of those who did it. He said they waited for night, that it was quick and honorable. But he did not smile. He turned away. A disturbing clarity emerged in those fragments. The jungle had not been silent. It had simply spoken in a tongue Westerners refused to understand. And then came the carvings. Anthropologists returning to the region in the late 62nd collected bish poles, towering wood sculptures created in the aftermath of ritual killings. One pole, stored in a Dutch museum, bore a haunting detail. The carved figure of a man, arms raised not in war, but in surrender, with hair curled in tight waves unlike any Asmat feature. Some believed it was Michael. Others dismissed it as coincidence. But when shown photographs of the figure, a tribal elder reportedly whispered, "That's the spirit of the white man who balanced the dead." Still, no body was ever recovered, no concrete proof. Yet, the Asmat had no reason to lie. They had no press conferences to hold, no international pressures. Their accounts raw, fragmented, sacred, offered something more real than diplomacy, emotional truth. And emotional truth, in this place, often outranked evidence. For decades, journalists returned. Some bribed, others pleaded. A few came close. The famed journalist Milt Macklin traveled to the region in the late 62nd and wrote of a villager who mimed a throat being slit when shown Michael's photo. Later, the man refused to repeat it. Even silence here tells stories. What Western eyes saw as mystery, the jungle held as memory. In the Asmat worldview, Michael didn't disappear. He was transformed, moved from flesh to myth, into a realm where the dead walk among the carved faces of wood and bone. And this is the uncomfortable truth. The jungle knows what it does not explain. In the West, we speak of closure as a kind of peace. In the Asmat world, closure comes through balance. The act of taking a life is not an ending, but a passage, part of an emotional logic deeper than courts or autopsies. Michael had entered a world where names held no protection, where even the powerful became symbols, where disappearance was not silence, but a ritual response. Still, his voice lingers low beneath the canopy, like the echo of a final breath that never quite stopped. It began as a whisper in a dusty archive. A single photograph, misfiled in a stack of anthropological records, tucked away in the Netherlands Tropen Museum. It showed a group of Asmat men, bare-chested and painted for ritual, gathered before a ceremonial house. And there, off to the side, half in shadow, half in profile, was a pale, bearded face. Narrow nose, deep-set eyes. Not Asmat, not Dutch, someone else. The year marked on the image was 1969, 8 years after Michael Rockefeller was declared dead. The photograph was sent quietly through academic circles, circulated among a small cluster of researchers and journalists who had followed the Rockefeller mystery like a fever dream. Some dismissed the figure as a trick of light. Others leaned closer, tracing the man's outline with trembling fingers, noting how he stood apart from the others, not as a tourist or authority, but as someone belonging and not belonging, assimilated perhaps, or watching for an exit. When the image reached the hands of Carl Hoffman, author of Savage Harvest, it ignited something deeper, the hunger for proof. Hoffman would later spend months in the Asmat region, walking the muddy trails between villages, asking impossible questions. And everywhere he went, the photo preceded him, a ghost held up to the living. Some villagers recognized the face, others turned away. One old man tapped the photograph with the back of a crooked fingernail. "He came from the sea," he said. "He stayed with us. He walked the mangroves like he was born here, but there was no name, only metaphors. The one who ran between worlds. The one with two shadows." Phrases more suited to mythology than history. Still, they returned to the same unspoken idea that Michael had not died when he vanished. The photograph became more than an image, it became a mirror of desire. For those who had grieved him, it offered hope. For those who had exploited the story, it gave relevance. For the Asmat, it reminded them of what they had chosen to bury. But something about it was wrong. It felt wrong. The man in the photo wore no Western clothes, no watch, no shoes. His hair had grown out in uneven clumps, and his posture was not one of fear or power. It was of waiting. And in that waiting, a deeper question emerged. Not was this Michael, but what would it mean if it was? To be alive, all those years later, would mean betrayal of his family, of the world that searched for him, of the man he once was. It would mean Michael chose disappearance over return, reinvention, over rescue. The possibility haunted even those who dismissed it, because the photograph was not alone. In the 1972nd, an Austrian missionary in the region claimed to have seen a white man living among a remote Asmat subgroup, fluent in the language, carving wood, participating in rituals. The man disappeared before he could be photographed. His hut was found days later, abandoned, swept clean, as if someone had erased the trace. Again and again, these glimpses surfaced, each one like a ripple disturbing the surface of accepted truth. A ghost refusing to fade. There is a psychological term, cryptamnesia, the return of forgotten memories under new names. But in the case of Michael Rockefeller, the world seemed to experience the opposite. A refusal to forget what was never truly known. A collective obsession that replayed his final journey over and over, hoping for a different ending. And always, the photo, pinned to boards, scanned in articles, whispered about in low voices on late-night forums. The longer it lived, the more symbolic it became. Not evidence, but invitation to speculate, to believe, or to mourn all over again. In the end, the man in the image may not be Michael at all. But then again, what if he is? What does it say about us that the idea of a man surviving, stripped of identity, swallowed by the jungle, haunts us more than the idea of his death? It is impossible to understand the mystery of Michael Rockefeller's disappearance without walking, if only in thought, through the ancient corridors of Asmat belief. Here, the line between flesh and spirit is not a wall, but a river traveled often, by the living and the dead alike. Among the Asmat, death does not end a man, it unsettles him. In their cosmology, the soul of a murdered person lingers in pain until vengeance is enacted, until another life is taken to close the mouth of the dead. Without this balance, the world tips into spiritual disarray. Illness spreads, crops fail, dreams darken. The spirit of the unavenged haunts the community like a wound that cannot close. This was the world Michael stepped into not just as an observer, but as a participant. Whether he understood it or not, he was entering a land governed by laws older than his language. In 1961, the Asmat were still recovering from violent colonial incursions. Dutch military forces had launched brutal campaigns in response to headhunting raids, a sacred tradition for the Asmat, now criminalized. Villages were bombed, men were arrested, cultural rituals were interrupted mid-ceremony, their poles chopped down, their sacred skulls taken or burned. In the Asmat view, these acts were not just warfare, they were desecrations. And in the village of Otsjanep, a specific number lingered. 5. 5 of their men had been killed during a Dutch-led police action in 1958. 5 spirits now drifted, unavenged. 5 mouths, open in the darkness, hungry. Then a white man appeared, exhausted, alone, washed ashore like a gift from the ancestors. No gun, no uniform, no protection. He spoke no Asmat. He wore no symbols. And yet, to those who saw him, he bore all the signs. They say the village debated for days, whether to help him, whether to wait, or whether he was the answer to a spiritual imbalance long overdue. The act, when it came, was not casual. It was ceremony. According to several later accounts gathered carefully, over years, from missionaries, anthropologists, and reluctant villagers, Michael was killed quickly. Speared, perhaps, bled. His body treated not with cruelty, but with the precision of a sacred rite. Parts of him were divided and consumed, not for hunger, but for spiritual realignment. His bones carved into tools, his spirit invoked in chants, his name never spoken again. It is horrifying, yes, but to the Asmat, it was not barbaric. It was the deepest form of remembrance, a return, a making right. This belief system defies Western morality, but it is not madness. It is order unfamiliar, but coherent. The uncomfortable truth. Michael Rockefeller may have become a symbol far more powerful in death than in life. And yet, the West cannot tolerate this version of events. It demands forensic clarity. Names, locations, timelines. Cannibalism is a taboo so profound that it collapses dialogue. It becomes an unthinkable, a reason to disbelieve the very people who might hold the truth. But listen carefully to the silences. In 2014, journalist Carl Hoffman interviewed a man in the Asmat region who, after hours of quiet buildup, admitted, yes, it happened. He had heard it from the old ones. The men who'd done it were now dead. Their spirits moved on. He was not like other white men, the villager said. He was brave. He accepted what came. No court would accept it as evidence. No body, no confession, only oral memory, passed in dusk-lit whispers, and yet it rings with an awful symmetry. The Rockefeller family has never publicly acknowledged this version. To do so would be to surrender to a narrative outside their control. A narrative where Michael's death was not random or meaningless but ritual, necessary, even invited. In the old carvings, spirits often emerge from the mouths of birds or crawl through the legs of ancestors. But sometimes they are depicted as returning figures, men who came from the sea, only to become part of the land. To be devoured is not always to be destroyed. It is to be transformed. Perhaps that is what happened. Perhaps Michael Rockefeller became what he sought to understand. Not a collector of cultures, but collected by one. Not a witness to history, but consumed by it. In a Manhattan vault lined with climate-controlled shelves and silence, there lies a journal, bound in soft leather, corners worn by damp and handling. It contains fragments of a mind on the cusp of dissolution. This was Michael's own log-part-field notebook, part inner monologue written during his final expedition through the Asmat territory. Officially, it was never meant to be read by the world. But between the pale blue lines and matter-of-fact notes about carvings, distances, weather patterns, something else pulses beneath. Fear, perhaps, or anticipation. Michael had written often of discomfort, the oppressive heat, the mosquitoes that swarmed like hunger itself, the food that never sat right in his stomach. But he never complained. What emerged instead was fascination, even awe. He wrote of nights spent in stilted huts, of chants that shook the woven walls, of men painting their bodies in ashes and ochre before slipping silently into the jungle with spears. And then, in a single, quiet entry, he wrote, "There is something here I'm not ready for. I don't mean danger, I mean recognition." He never explained the line, but it hung there like smoke, curling towards something unspoken. Another passage, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, noted a conversation with a local interpreter. The Asmat villagers, the man said, were worried. Michael was asking too many questions. He was going into places where Dutch officers were still feared, still hated. He was treading, the man said, between bones. Michael's response in the journal was chillingly simple. "If I go farther, I see more." The Rockefeller family kept the full contents of the journal from the public for years. Only select entries were shared with researchers. Some say that was to protect Michael's legacy. Others whisper of darker reasons. Entries were rumored to reference dreams, recurring ones of being watched by men without eyes, of hearing singing from under the water, of a boat that never reached shore, and always the motif of movement. Michael was obsessed with the idea of motion escape, pursuit, immersion. He had written to a friend months earlier, "I don't want to be an observer anymore. I want to dissolve into it, to be something unknown." It's a dangerous wish, one that flirts with erasure. In retrospect, those writings feel less like a journal than a confession, a breadcrumb trail into a mind gradually unfastening itself from its homeland, its lineage, its mirrors. But the journal isn't the only artifact that survived. Among Michael's belongings returned to the States carefully cataloged and boxed by Dutch authorities was a carved figurine wrapped in cloth, small, less ornate than the ones he collected. Its face was human, but distorted half blank. Its arms raised, not in welcome, but in surrender. Some believe he carved it himself. Others think it was given to him in secret. A token. A warning. Carl Hoffman later speculated that Michael may have known, at least in his final hours, that he had crossed an invisible line. That he had gone too far into a world where intention doesn't save you and purity is no shield. That the jungle sees only presence and decides what to do with it. There is, in these journals, a tone that shifts as the days pass, from wonder to urgency to something closer to stillness, as if the writing itself had begun to slow, like breath thinning before sleep. The final entry, half-smudged and incomplete, reads simply, "They came this morning, painted, singing. I was told not to speak. No date, no signature, no page after." It reads like the moment a door closed, not slammed but sealed. As if Michael, willingly or not, had stepped across from the known into the mythic. And the West does not handle myths well. We want names, motives, photographs. But what Michael left behind was a feeling, a sense that perhaps the final truth of his story isn't a headline or theory, but a kind of silence. The silence of a man who wanted to disappear and may have succeeded. In the world of unsolved deaths, the absence of a body is more than a gap, it is an open wound, a refusal of closure, a silent defiance of what we think death should leave behind. For Michael Rockefeller, there was no body, no remains, not a single bone. Search teams scoured the coastline for weeks. The Dutch Navy mapped currents and tides, calculating how far a human corpse could drift. Divers plunged into swamps thick with shadow. Soldiers marched through villages with photographs, offering food, tools, money for any trace. But nothing surfaced, no fragment of skin, no belt buckle, no hand-carved glasses frame. As if the jungle had not only taken Michael, but made the decision to digest him completely. And that silence, the utter lack of physical confirmation, became its own presence. In the family's private memorial held months later in New York, the pews were filled with the powerful governors, patrons, museum directors. But at the front of the church, the casket was empty. A simple urn of sand was placed on a pedestal. Symbolic, gentle, denial wrapped in ritual. Nelson Rockefeller spoke only briefly. His voice trembled, not when he mentioned his son's name, but when he thanked the people who had tried to bring him back, as if the attempt itself had become sacred, as if not bringing Michael home had cast a long, subtle shame. For years, the absence of the body became the battleground for every theory. If he had drowned, surely the sea would have offered something up, clothes, bones, scraps. But the Arafura Sea, while shallow in places, is not known for keeping secrets. Currents push debris toward shore. Bodies wash up. But nothing did. If he had been taken by crocodiles, as one Dutch officer once quietly suggested, there would still be remains. A feeding frenzy in shallow water leaves evidence: torn fabric, a limb. But again, nothing. And then there was the alternative. If he had been killed intentionally and consumed, could the total erasure be explained? In some traditional Asmat rituals, when vengeance is enacted through ritual cannibalism, the body is not simply eaten, it is distributed. Bones are crushed and used in tools, hair braided into ornaments, flesh shared in ceremonial meals. Death becomes dispersal. A Western mind recoils. But in that worldview, this dispersal is a kind of immortality. Anthropologist Peter Mathiesen, who traveled to Asmat territory years after the disappearance, once asked an elder why no trace of Michael had ever surfaced. The elder, through an interpreter, answered only, "Because we did not want to share him." There was a terrifying beauty in that phrase. Not malicious, not triumphant. Simply a statement of spiritual ownership, of secrecy that protects rather than confesses. To this day, no forensic discovery has ever been made. No bone sent for DNA testing. No village child stumbling upon a weathered skull or rusted belt. And while rumors still flicker an unmarked grave here, a hidden cave there, none have ever yielded the proof needed to rewrite the official story. But the lack itself, it began to reshape the narrative. Michael's death, without remains, became porous. It could be filled with anything. Fear, hope, conspiracy, denial. It became a myth machine, and myths, by nature, resist resolution. The Rockefeller family eventually stopped commenting. They allowed the silence to stand. In museum halls, Michael's name appears on plaques, beside wood carvings he collected as photographs quietly credited. No cause of death is listed, just his birth and his disappearance. And perhaps that was always the way it was meant to be. Because in some cultures, the body is not the proof of death. It is the anchor that keeps the soul from drifting. By vanishing, Michael became unanchored, unfixed in time, free to haunt. We search for remains to bury something to say, here, this is where the story ends. But Michael never gave us that. And so, the story never ends. In the quiet corners of conspiracy, where grief mingles with longing, a different story took root, one that refused to accept death, or at least not the kind offered by the official record. It began, as such things do, with a whisper, a fragment of a letter, a claimed sighting in an airport, a photograph of a pale man in ceremonial beads and animal hide, half turned away from the camera. Each piece by itself was nothing, but together they began to murmur an impossible possibility. What if Michael Rockefeller didn't die? What if he chose to disappear? The escape theory has no single author. It bloomed in the fertile shadow, left by the body that never came. From the start, Michael had been an unusual heir. While his peers prepared for Wall Street and campaign trails, Michael stripped himself of entitlement. He wore the same dirty khakis day after day. He ate with his hands. He studied primitive art, not from afar, but from the mouths of those who made it. Some say he was searching for truth. Others that he was running from legacy, from expectation, from himself. In one letter to a friend before leaving for New Guinea, he wrote, "I want to be not just a footnote in someone else's history." A sentence that now reads, like both a mission statement and a warning. Years after his disappearance, scattered reports began to emerge. A German missionary claimed to have encountered a white man living in isolation deep in the highlands, speaking fluent Asmat and refusing contact. A pilot saw what he believed was a signal fire on an uninhabited island known to harbor Asmat hunters. A cryptic message, possibly in Michael's handwriting, was allegedly discovered in a Dutch anthropology archive signed only M. The most persistent claim came from an Australian photographer who recounted a trek in 1973 through inland Asmat villages. There, he said, he saw a man, white, barefoot, heavily bearded, carving wood in a corner of the longhouse. The villagers said nothing. The man didn't look up. By the time the photographer returned weeks later with officials, the man was gone. His bedding, they said, had been removed. The ashes of his fire swept clean. But why would Michael run? Some believe it was trauma, that he witnessed or experienced something in the days following the catamaran wreck, violence, ritual, or captivity that made returning impossible. Others suggest he wanted to stay, that in those final days, he saw in the Asmat a form of freedom so absolute it rendered his old life irrelevant. A life without glass offices, without family legacies, without mirrors. But if he stayed willingly, then he abandoned everything: his mother, his siblings, the father who wept behind closed doors for decades. Such betrayal seems cruel, even monstrous. And yet, perhaps it was not cruelty, but transformation. In some escape narratives, there is no villain. Only flight, only shedding. Like a snake slipping from its skin, the man who was Michael Rockefeller may have simply stepped into a new form. No need for permission. No plan to return. The darker corners of the theory twist toward spy fiction. That Michael knew something about colonial operations, about the art world, about anthropology and power that made him dangerous, that someone silenced him or helped him vanish. But these tales lack the heat of emotional truth. They feel too mechanical, too cold. The more haunting possibility is not that he was killed or silenced, but that he left and did not want to be found. That somewhere, far from the curated halls of his father's world, a man with no name carved spirits into wood as rain beat gently on a thatched roof. That he shed his lineage like a wet shirt. That he was never lost. He was just elsewhere. And if that's true, if he escaped, what does that make of us? Those who kept searching? Those who demanded answers? Those who built museums around his absence? Sometimes, the most unbearable truth is not that someone died, but that they chose not to come home. Beneath the layers of mystery and folklore, behind the claims of cannibalism and escape, lies a quieter, colder truth. There were those in power who did not want the full story told. When Michael Rockefeller disappeared in 1961, it was not just the loss of a young man, it was a diplomatic fault line. Dutch New Guinea was teetering on the edge of geopolitical collapse. The Dutch colonial presence, already weakening, faced mounting pressure from Indonesia to relinquish control of the territory. The last thing the Netherlands needed was a scandal involving the heir of America's most prominent family killed, possibly eaten by the very people they claimed to be civilizing. And so, within days, the tone of the Dutch authorities changed, from search and rescue to contain and manage. Reports from the field were filtered before being sent back to Jakarta and The Hague. A Dutch priest, who had lived among the Asmat for decades, wrote of hearing from villagers that Michael had been killed. His letters were intercepted. A colonial officer compiled testimonies from locals that pointed to a ritual killing. His files were marked confidential and buried in archives for over 30 years. Even as the Rockefeller family deployed their own resources, they were met with vague denials, half-translations, and shifting narratives. Nelson Rockefeller, though outwardly composed, was deeply frustrated. Behind the scenes, he reportedly pressured the Dutch government for answers. What he received in return was diplomacy-measured statements about probabilities and natural hazards. The unspoken truth: the Dutch had too much to lose. Acknowledging a violent death at the hands of the Asmat would have sparked outrage. It would have fed anti-colonial sentiment and drawn global attention to a region already teetering on political instability. More than that, it would have marked a failure of Western control. The colonizers would have lost not just a young man, but the illusion of authority. And the Rockefellers? They too had reasons for silence. Despite their sorrow, the family remained careful. There were no lawsuits, no public demands for renewed investigations. They did not accuse. They did not pursue vengeance. Instead, they built. Michael's legacy was folded into the Museum of Primitive Art. Exhibits grew. Foundations were funded. And Michael, in absentia, became a symbol of cultural curiosity and courage. But in private, the family preserved everything: his letters, his photographs, his sketches, and, according to several biographers, they also preserved knowledge details shared only behind closed doors. Whispers from missionaries, reports from private investigators, fragments of truth, enough to form a whole, but they did not share them. There is a weight that comes with being a Rockefeller, a duty to preserve not only legacy, but dignity. To publicly accept a death like Michael's, if it were true, would be to accept that one of their own had been consumed by a world he tried to understand. It would stain the myth, make him not a martyr or an explorer, but a sacrifice. So, instead, silence. Years turned to decades. Documents remained sealed. Witnesses aged and died. In 2014, when Carl Hoffman uncovered compelling testimonies pointing to Michael's death by ritual killing accounts from Asmat men, who claimed to know the exact details, there was still no official response from the Rockefeller family. No comment, no acknowledgement. The Dutch Foreign Ministry declined to reopen any files. The past, it seemed, had been tidily buried under layers of political dust. But silence, like water, seeps. In the jungles of Asmat, in the halls of museums, In the scattered notes of journalists and anthropologists, the truth persists, not in declarations, but in omission. In the spaces between statements, in the way governments redact, in the way families protect, there is a kind of grief that never speaks its name. A grief that preserves the dead not as they were, but as they must be remembered. Michael's disappearance demanded such grief, one wrapped in reverence and strategic forgetting. And so, the silence remains not as absence, but as architecture. A structure built to hold the weight of what cannot be said aloud. We are left to listen for what lies beneath. In the mangrove dusk of the Arafura coast, water remembers. It holds no shape, but it echoes. Ripples where no hand touches. Currents shift without wind. And though the years have passed, something still stirs where Michael Rockefeller last entered the sea, where his name, even now, drifts like mist just above the tide. Time has softened the outlines of the story, worn them like stone under rain. The world no longer gasps at his disappearance. His name is not on nightly news, not whispered in parliaments or dinner parties. And yet, in anthropology classrooms, in expedition memoirs, and along the carved beams of Asmat longhouses, he lives fragmented, refracted, never fully explained. Michael's legacy was never a monument. It was a question. He went in search of meaning, of something elemental, perhaps purity, perhaps danger. And whether he found it or was consumed by it is a mystery that refuses to close. Some say he became a symbol, a warning, the ultimate cautionary tale of the Westerner, who crosses too deep into the other seeking truth, only to lose himself in it. But perhaps this is too simple, too moralistic, because Michael, by all accounts, understood more than most. He approached the Asmat not with conquest, but with awe. He did not seek to civilize. He sought to witness, and still, he vanished. There's an irony in that the boy who wanted to escape the weight of his last name ended up building its most mysterious chapter. That the man who sought connection left behind the longest silence. It is almost poetic, the kind of ending that writes itself into myth. To the Asmat, he may be remembered not as victim, but as participant, a figure woven into their cosmology, whether by death, by choice, or by spirit. In some versions of their story, he balanced the deaths of their own. In others, he crossed into their world and was transformed. To the west, he is the prince who walked into the forest and never returned. But listen closer. In recent years, the rivers near Otsianup are quieter. The elders who knew the truth are mostly gone. The longhouses are modernized now, lit by solar panels, interrupted by cell towers. The world presses inward. Even the Asmat are changing. Yet when asked gently, respectfully about the white man who came from the sea, there is still a pause, a hesitation, then a phrase, spoken not with malice, but with finality. He went into the water, and the water kept him. Perhaps that is the closest we'll ever come to an answer. Perhaps that is enough. Because some stories are not puzzles to be solved, but songs to be sung again and again, not for what they reveal, but for how they make us feel. The sorrow, the awe, the vertigo of never knowing. In a New York museum, there is a carved Asmat pole, taller than a man, darkened by age, etched with spirits rising from birds and rivers. It stands silently near a photograph